Hi there. My name is Olivia Gibbon, and I'm the Advocacy Specialist at KASAP. If you can tell, I'm in this Zoom meeting by myself. Typically, our lunch and learn sessions, we record them live and later upload them for others to watch. During this session on January 26th, we were unaware until the end that it was not being recorded. Luckily, we were able to download the chat, and my pre-written script and slide deck were still available. So I'll be re-recording it here now. The content is the same from what you saw live if you attended. Some parts of the presentation you may be already familiar with, especially in the opening slides as I introduce myself and explain the Lunch and Learn series. I hope you enjoy the presentation as much as I did putting it together, and you join us for our next session in the series on March 23rd. From here on is the presentation that occurred on Wednesday, January 26th at 12 p.m. Eastern. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Gibbon, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the Advocacy Specialist here at the Kentucky Coalition of Sexual Assault Programs, or KASAP as it is commonly referred. I'm a fat, white, cisgender woman with curly blonde hair and a black shirt. I'm sitting behind a blank white wall in an orange chair. Instead of enabling the live transcription, that Zoom offers, which is not consistently accurate, I'm trying something new. I wrote a script beforehand that should be displayed to the right of your slide to act as our captions. You can adjust the size of the notes, the actual slide, or the preview of the slide at the top by hovering over any of those boxes and sliding your cursor that works for you. What you see on the screen is what I will be saying today. The Lunch and Learn series was created by the Anti-Oppression Working Group. If you're interested in learning more about this group or any other working group, please reach out to me after the presentation. Any Rape Crisis Center staff can present at a Lunch and Learn, either by themselves like I am today, or with a co-presenter with someone else. I'm putting in the chat now a link to the Lunch and Learn application form. If you're interested in presenting something this year, or just have a general idea of something you would want to see explored more, please fill out this form and I'll reach out. The dates for the following sessions of the year are listed on the form as well. And here's the link, which will be at the end of the presentation as well. Thank you to Serinda, who will be helping with the chat today, and another big thank you to Becca Mattingly and Keisha Morgan at Ampersand, who met with me and shared their amazing insights into this topic. The two of them helped facilitate different support groups at Ampersand, one being previously offered that was centered exclusively on fat survivors. I've included Ampersand's information on the resources page as well. This Lunch and Learn would not be what it is without the supportive community. The recording of today's session, this PowerPoint deck, as well as the original transcript will be available by the end of this week. The topic we're discussing is something I can talk about forever, but for the sake of time, I had to reduce the content that we will cover today. It is not because I think any specific information is more important than the other. It is because I got too excited about the topic and got a little more detailed than an hour will allow. And some pieces are included but heavily condensed. I've included these slides in the intended script if there was one after the closing slide. Okay, so before we get into things, I want to look at our shared goals for today's session. I also love a good meme and couldn't resist adding in this one I found on social media last summer. It shows a photo of an older model car veering off suddenly onto an off-ramp from the interstate. There are two exit signs above the car, the left one reading, "But being fat doesn't mean you're unhealthy. A lot of fat people are healthy." And the right one reading, "People have intrinsic worth and the right to be treated with respect regardless of their size or health status." This meme is poking fun, but is looking at the overall idea of fat phobia and the often unconscious but insidious ways that thin or straight-sized people have conversations about bodies with fat people. We have a lot to go over, and I'm excited to learn with y'all today over the next hour. This content will hopefully serve as a jumping off point in your own unlearning of fat phobia and diet culture, and that you will continue to have these conversations once we leave here today. Let's get started. Any type of oppression, whether it be racism, fat phobia, transphobia, ableism, etc., can be seen in different levels: individual, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. This graphic comes from the National Equity Project, and I like the way it breaks down the different levels. The graphic shows a Venn diagram with the circle on the left labeled individual, the right circle labeled systemic, with the link in the middle of the two circles reading interpersonal. Inside the left circle labeled individual, it reads, "A person's beliefs and actions that serve to perpetuate oppression." And under that reads, "Conscious and unconscious, and externalized and internalized." Inside the right circle are the words institutional and structural. Under institutional, it reads, policies and practices at the organization or sector level that perpetuate oppression. Under structural, it reads, how these effects interact and accumulate across institutions and across history. Under interpersonal, in the middle link of the two circles reads, the interactions between people both within and across difference. I want us to keep this graphic with us as we move throughout the rest of today's content. The first Lunch and Learn of 2021, hosted by Jerusha and Catherine, focused entirely on anti-oppression work and is a great starting resource. And if you're interested in accessing that recording, please reach out to me and I'll send it your way. I wish that we were able to spend more time discussing this here, but there's only so much time in the session to cover everything. The word fat is not bad. Being described as fat is not a bad thing. Fat is a descriptor, just like being a brunette or being short. I wanted to make a point and state this, not just for the purposes of what I'm presenting today, but so that each of us can begin to look at our own individual relationships with our bodies. Are there any questions or comments before we move on? Fatphobia is defined as the irrational fear, aversion to, or discrimination against obesity or people with obesity. That is a very vague definition. How do we define obesity and who gets to be the authority on who is obese and who isn't? The biggest tool that we use to measure obesity today is the body mass index tool, or BMI. Its creation was not meant to be used how it is today, and its continued use upholds racist and fatphobic body standards. The Quetelet Index was created not by a medical physician, but by a mathematician named Lambert Quetelet in Belgium in the 1800s. In his book, A Treatise on Man and the Development of His Faculties, he states that if an average man is determined, then all other men can be compared against that average man, and any different would constitute a monstrosity. The average man Quetelet was referencing the average man Quetelet was referencing were white European men and did not take into account a person's muscle or bone density in the math or other factors like a uterus. In 1972, a physiologist named Ansel Keys, also not a medical physician, promoted the Quetelet Index, which was now being referred to as the BMI, as a great tool for indicating obesity, an idea that was later popularized by the US National Institutes of Health a decade later. If we tie this back into the definition of fatphobia, we can see how even the tools that are supposed to measure our supposed health and success in diet culture are based on bogus science championed by two white men who were not medical professionals. I also say that in acknowledging that the medical system as a whole is fatphobic, hence why we use the BMI to begin with. So at this point in the original presentation, there was conversation coming in through the chat. So I will now read to you what was coming in through the chat at this time in the presentation. A question in the chat comes in asking, if we request to not be weighed, do we have the opportunity to deny service? This is when I also said, I first want to say that I'm not an attorney and cannot speak on any legality around a doctor refusing your service. You are allowed to say no. In any part of life, you're allowed to say no. Depending on who or what you say no to, there can be a consequence that isn't ideal, being asked to leave a store, someone not selling you a good or a service, etc. But seeking medical care should not be seen the same way. Medical professionals claim to follow the Hippocratic Oath, which includes the idea of doing no harm. Getting weighed at the doctor cannot determine if you have cancer, diabetes, or even pregnancy. All getting weighed at the doctor does is show the doctor that the density of your body has changed. If your doctor cannot provide you medical care, regardless of the reason for the visit, without having to weigh you, I would question their ability to provide anyone medical care, fat or not. And as I have seen in my own case, if you push back even a little on a policy an institution has, they will relent. Doing that as a thin person is brave, but doing it as a fat person can be terrifying. Do what feels best for you and what makes you feel most safe. Some other responses in the chat related to this question read, one client at my clinic will get weighed but refuses to look and be told her weight. So many obese people suffer from health-related problems because they do not want to be weighed, so they just won't go. And someone else said, with agreeing with the point of fat people avoiding the doctor at all, I was just thinking about the impact that the trauma of fat experiences in medical care could have on a survivor's feelings around seeking medical care after an assault. And that was from the chat during this time in the live presentation. The graphics related to the fatphobia definition on this slide both show a pie chart with the first one labeled what people think fatphobia is, with one of the two options being a literal fear of fat people, making up the smaller section of the pie, And I hate fat people making up the larger portion of the pie. The second graphic shows the same pie chart, this time labeled what it actually is, with lots of different portions, including only dating thin people, being told losing weight will cure an illness, fat people getting paid less, life and health insurance discrimination, etc. I think these two graphics do a great job at showing how ingrained fat phobia is within our society and the choices that we think we can make on our own. Before I move on to diet culture, are there any other questions or comments about anything we've talked about so far? In her book, What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, Aubrey Gordon defines diet culture as a system that elevates thin bodies above all others and interprets thinness as a sign of health and virtue, therefore pure. Diet culture mandates weight loss as a way of increasing social status, strengthening character, and accessing social privilege. Much like most information presented about fat bodies, diet culture is not based in science, fact, or even grounded in the lived reality of fat bodies. It is instead centered around the idea of good and bad choice and being less than if you don't meet white thin body standards, like in Aubrey's definition. Fat phobia is rooted in anti-Blackness and Puritan ideology. Another way we see Puritan ideology manifested is in purity culture. An entire separate lunch and learn could be done just on the history of fat phobia and its roots in anti-Blackness and Puritan ideology, but I unfortunately could not do the topic justice in the little time we have today. I've included in the appendix a slide with links and book references to help you get started if interested in learning more. White women have historically been the gatekeepers of diet culture and who set the rules of what is accepted as the norm. Black women historically did not subscribe to any type of diet culture, especially since diet culture by default sees their bodies as a problem. Sabrina String's book, Fearing the Black Body, talks in more detail about this, and I've included a link to an interview where she talks about the book in the additional slides. We can see the overlaps between diet culture and rape culture, terms that we'll cover today, as well as purity culture or Puritan ideology. Even if we don't consciously think we subscribe to diet culture, our lives and systems are dictated by it. The graphic for diet culture shows a drawing of different snacks or foods that are labeled as healthy alternatives. Some of the items drawn are Skinny Pop, Slim Fast, Lara bars, Baby Bell cheese, and more. I would like to point out that there's nothing wrong or bad about you enjoying these foods. I would also like to point out that you're getting no additional nutritional value and in some cases are consuming more processed chemicals than the original food you're trying to replace. It is not your personal failure that you eat or even like these foods. Like we said, diet culture is insidious and everywhere. So here's where I'll read another piece from the chat from the original presentation. Participants put responses in the chat about other examples of diet culture food that read, the Skinny Cow ads. Somebody else said, I think like White Claws and the rave around the healthiness of them, when in reality, they're still an alcoholic beverage, regardless of caloric content. Someone else said, and I do love Lara bars, peanut butter chocolate for the win. I also asked the question, if you're comfortable telling, how old were you when you were on your first diet? It could have been a traditional diet like Weight Watchers or Atkins, or when you first started restricting your diet and replacing foods with diet alternatives like Slim Fast or 100-calorie bars. Some of those answers read as, my mom put me on a diet in 3rd grade. My first diet was when I was 8. My mom was on Weight Watchers and she took me to meetings with her. And another one read, I was never put on a diet explicitly, but my parents policed what I was eating and how much I ate heavily. So fatness, like other facets of a person's life, exists on a spectrum. And where a person is placed on that spectrum or placed by others can determine both the amount of barriers as well as the specific ways that person is impacted by each barrier based on their size and society's perceptions that go with that size. I chose 2 different graphics that are presenting the same information so we can get a more well-rounded idea of what this spectrum looks like in real life. The photo on the left shows an arrow going upwards at an angle. There's a bubble to the left of the arrow that reads, the easiest way to visualize the fat spectrum is an arrow pointing up. As your size and weight go up, so do the number of barriers you face. The top of the arrow reads small fats, mid fats, large fats, super and infinite fats. The graphic on the right also looks at the fatness spectrum, but gives a little more context to the different labels of fatness people can use to describe themselves. I would be considered a small fat and have at one time been a mid fat. Super fat is 4x to 5x, and infinite fat is 6x and up. As the left graphic shows, the higher in weight, the less options you have and more barriers you face. While I know that being fat puts me at a great disadvantage when it comes to certain structures I navigate, I'm still able to be mostly accommodated in my daily life with things like clothing, travel, seating, etc. Simply being a part of a marginalized community and experiencing trauma as a result of being in that community is not the same thing as being in community together. Being in community with your community means that you care about what happens to the whole community, not just the part that looks like you or matches your personal experience. This is another piece from the chat as well. There were multiple comments in the chat while I presented this slide, some responding to what I said and some expanding on other topics. Some posts read as clothes that fit fat people are being snapped up on Depop, talking about the idea of thin people buying plus size clothes to wear them as oversized, leaving even more limited options for fat people. Another comment reads, the frustrating thing for me is being too skinny for plus size clothes, but too fat for normal clothes. Another comment reads, not to mention when you are short and fat, everything is too long. They think if you're fat, you're tall. Another one reads, frustrating that when I hear mid-size, I automatically think of a car. Another comment read, and I've had no problem finding beautiful, bright clothes, and I'm plus size. Okay, we have now gone over systems of oppression and how those systems create structures that perpetuate and uphold fat phobia and diet culture. We have also talked definitions and we have now added in the layer of history, connecting the dots to show how fat phobia and sexual violence find common ground, anti-Blackness, and Puritan ideology or Puritan culture. We as advocates must accept this reality and take responsibility to unpack our own internalized fat phobia, anti-Blackness, and Puritan views on bodies, if we ever want to begin to support fat survivors in a meaningful way. Our centers are made up of predominantly white women, and I would suspect to assume each center has in some way perpetuated diet culture. If we're going to shift away from that model, we must first name out loud what the problem is in order to change it. In this work, we understand that sexual assault is not about sex or desire, it's about power. Even though we understand that, most of society and media does not. Rape culture is defined as social attitudes and beliefs about the normalization and trivialization of sexual violence. We perpetuate rape culture every day, each one of us, myself included. It, like most things, exists on a spectrum. So what happens when rape culture meets fat phobia? To exist in a fat body is to be seen as someone who lives in excess and therefore has no self-control. People who have no self-control don't know how to say no. To be sexually assaulted is to have someone exert their power over you while also taking what little control or safety you may have felt or currently feel within your body. If my body as a fat person is both seen and societally accepted as unattractive, which we should interpret as undesirable, and I have no sense of control, then how can I even know I was raped? If I go to the hospital and say I want to complete a kit, is the nurse going to believe that someone would want to even do that to someone with my body? If I go to make a police report and they see my fat body, but they also see that I'm 5'10" and I have broad shoulders, are they going to assume that I should have been able to overpower my perpetrator? Or will they see my white skin and I'm now seen as defenseless, soft thing who has no control over what happens to her? Something that white women use and weaponize constantly. It's my own fault for being fat and soft and not thin and strong. If I go to a rape crisis center, am I going to be able to sit in the chairs the advocate is offering me, or will the arms of it cut into my hips? And the pressure on my hips could trigger a trauma response of the assault. And instead of saying something, which is not my job to do, I either suffer through and zone out through all the paperwork, or I get up and leave and don't receive any services at all. These are all real ways that fat survivors can experience barriers to support when navigating the aftermath of sexual violence. We can see how rape culture and fat phobia collide, deterring survivors from seeking support, which then reinforces these very same stereotypes that fat people can't be raped. Because if you were raped, you would report it, or go to the hospital, or seek out a rape crisis center. It also reinforces the stereotype that fat people can't be raped because rape is about desire. Remembering that fat phobia, and by extension diet culture, is rooted in anti-Blackness and Puritan ideology, we must stand firm in our understanding that fighting back fat phobia and diet culture is inherently anti-racist and equitable. I've included two different violence structure pyramids, both showing the ways it can escalate interpersonally and systemically. The pyramid on the right shows the progression of white supremacy, starting with indifference and rising up to mass murder. The pyramid on the left is similar, but looks at gender-based violence in its climb. One glaring way that these graphics and others similar that look at violence fall short is in not including fatphobia. Erasure on graphics can lead to misinformation being taught to future clinicians, social workers, and medical professionals. That misinformation combined with ubiquitous messaging in media about diet culture, and we can see how we then get federal policies removing sodas from school cafeterias while still allowing students to go into debt over failure to pay lunch money, or presidential fitness tests, or the Noom app, or weighing elementary school kids and teaching them how to calculate their own BMI. So I want to pause here to give everyone a chance to reflect on what we've discussed so far, see how you're feeling in your body, take care of yourself in whatever way that means, and also take time to check the chat and see if there's anything that we need to address in the moment. And of course, at this point in the regular presentation, there are comments coming in. So the remainder of the chat has multiple different topics going. I was not able to keep up with while I was presenting this slide. I've included the downloaded chat with the rest of this session's content if you would like to see what else is discussed. Now let's look at how diet culture can look in our workplaces. This is a pretty long list, but sadly not exhaustive list. Instead of me talking more about this, I want to give you all a few minutes to read through these and see which ones, if any, stood out for you. I will type this list into the chat as well, and it is included in the downloaded chat. And these are questions that I prompted to people in the chat as well. Are there any on here that you don't agree with or were shocking to see? I'm happy to talk about any of these in more detail. We are all learning today, and this is just a beginning conversation. We cannot change if we do not question our own assumptions first. These examples are not just things that happen between staff and directors. These things are being modeled in front of survivors, or depending on what type of center you work in, children as well. Having a workplace culture entrenched in diet culture does not make fat people feel safe, staff or survivors. Okay, I have listed here different systems. Knowing all the things we talked about today, what are some ways that diet culture or fat phobia in general can show up in these systems? As I'm reading through my examples, feel free to add your own or expand on these in the chat. So for education, we have paying for school lunch or going into debt. Food deserts, the Center for Women and Families is technically in a food desert. And then just SNAP funding cuts in general. The very idea that people have to pay for food to survive is fat phobic and is classist and relies on the idea that people should fend for themselves. Housing, we have evictions, gentrification, non-ADA compliant housing, non-working appliances, landlord discrimination, pet infestations, health hazards. For public safety, we have non-accessible playground or park equipment for children of all sizes, which is also important for disability access as well. Cracked or uneven sidewalks, burnout street lamps, if there even are any, and what's called anti-homeless architecture. I provided an example of this on the slide to the left. Bars are put in the middle of a bench or sometimes even spikes to split it into 3 sections, preventing someone from laying down or a fat body from sitting comfortably. Public transportation. Everything about US public transportation is fat phobic. The seating or lack thereof, the unreliability of the arrival or departure times, having to walk long distances between stops, having to use stairs to get into a bus. Airline travel in general is very fat phobic. It's very expensive for fat people to fly. There are many articles that you can look at online from different airlines where fat people have experienced real trauma trying to fly and just getting where they're going about their lives. For law enforcement, one real life example of this is the murder of Eric Garner by NYPD in 2014. He was blamed for his own death via chokehold by the media and public opinion, with one person saying to CNN shortly after the trial that, quote, "You had a 350-pound person who was resisting arrest. The police were trying to bring him down as quickly as possible. If he had not had asthma and a heart condition and was so obese, almost definitely he would not have died." Mr. Garner never resisted arrest. Even if he had resisted arrest, police are allegedly trained in nonviolence de-escalation. And there are videos that go viral showing that police can, in fact, be nonviolent with fat people that they are attempting to subdue. Police do not see Black bodies, especially fat Black bodies, as anything other than a threat. When his daughter Erica passed away in 2017 at the age of 27 by heart attack, media outlets were quick to conflate the size of her body with the cause of her death, instead of pointing out the real reasons for her death: racial trauma, fat phobia and diet culture, and medical racism, among others. And then finally, we have legislation or public policy. We touched on this earlier, but you can take a deeper look at legislation that centers around food or any new initiatives whose funding is tied to that legislation to see if its roots are tied in fat phobia or diet culture. And that is the end of the first Lunch and Learn of 2022. Thank you so much for joining, whether you originally joined live or you're now watching this recording of re-recording the original presentation. And thank you for being so flexible and understanding in us having technical difficulties and needing to re-record the session. Please fill out the feedback link that is listed at the end of this presentation and on the slide. And it was also listed in the original email with this presentation link that you got from me. Feel free to also email me at advocacy@kasap.org with any questions or concerns. The references used and additional resources are listed on the next slide, which you can see here. This includes both, again, the references that were used for the presentation, as well as just additional resources that I thought were really important. And then we have this slide as well. After the final slide showing resources and references, you will see this page titled, "If Interested in Exploring More." The content that follows this slide can act as an appendix for you to access what I could not fully include in the presentation. Some content was condensed heavily because of the time limit, like anti-oppression or an history of fat phobia. And some was removed completely because it didn't fit with the original flow of the presentation, but are extras if you want to expand your learning of fat phobia and diet culture. Some of the slides will have brief notes, some will have graphics, will just have graphics or links, and some will be completely finished with a script attached. Look around, ask questions, and then question how you feel in your body and your mind as you go through each slide. I would love nothing more than to expand the presentation's content into another session or taking some of this content from the appendix and expanding it. I welcome any and all feedback as well as suggestions for future lunch and learns and general training topics. The link to provide that information to me is also included in the original email. Thank you again, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. And then again, I include the links here. And if you keep going through the slide deck, which is included in the email that I sent, you can see more information about anti-oppression. There is an additional slide, which you'll see a full script about intuitive eating, as well as body positivity versus body neutrality. I was really interested in this, and I think it could have been included. It just was too big of a topic to include for the little amount of time we had. So that's why that was not included. Again, like I referenced in the presentation, links, great books, starting off point to explore the history of fat phobia, anti-Blackness, the idea of bodies as being monstrous, all of those things. And if you get through these and you want to look at more, please reach out to me. This was another slide of an example that it just didn't work with the original flow of the presentation, but this is just a list of, in my opinion, positive fat representation in media. These are all they're actually all TV shows. These are all shows that I've watched, and I feel that as a fat person, seeing these fat characters feel positive for me. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. I would love to hear more. Please send me your suggestions, or if you want to know what any of these shows are about and you want to talk about them, reach out. Let's chat. I love all of these shows. And this is the last extra slide that's included. This is specifically looking at fat survivor representation in media. And unfortunately, as you can see, I only found 2. And these are also going off of, again, what I can verify, what I have read or what I have consumed. Dietland, which you'll see on the left, is a TV show. Hunger was a memoir that Roxane Gay wrote. The script that you'll see on the right just focuses on Dietland. I did not have time to write Hunger because I realized that it wouldn't fit into the presentation, so I stopped. But if you want to know more about the book, about Hunger, especially about some of the content warning in it, feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk with you about it. But that is our entire presentation. Again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. KASAP really appreciates it, and I cannot wait to hear more about feedback and for everyone to join us on March 23rd. Thank you so much.